Great. So, welcome to the third edition of the ACSIS Exchange webinar series. And today we'll be looking at the topic of reparation and restitution. Welcome to the ACSIS Exchange webinar series, a bold and necessary platform for confronting one of the most pressing and polarizing issues of our time: reparations and restitution. This dialogue situates African and Caribbean leadership at the heart of a global reckoning with historic and ongoing injustice, and calls for decisive, unapologetic responses to structural inequalities that continue to shape our geopolitical economic realities. As the world navigates the resurgence of Trump-era policies, such as renewed threats of immigration bans disproportionately targeting African and Caribbean peoples, and intensifying climate crises rooted in exploitative colonial legacies, the ACSIS platform challenges us to ask, what does justice look like in a world still unwilling to fully confront its past? This reparations restitution session brings together global thinkers, life coaches, investors, and policymakers to examine the enduring impact of systemic harm, from racialized health disparities and exclusionary border regimes to the legacy of underinvestment in African and Caribbean public health infrastructure. These are not isolated issues. They are the aftershocks of slavery, colonialization, and dispossession. At the crossroads of trade, climate, and equity, we ask, how can Africa and the Caribbean assert sovereignty, demand redress, and build sustainable, self-determined futures? What role does reparative justice play in reclaiming our health, our economies, and our voices? The world is watching. The time for transformative action is now. Be part of this conversation. So I'm going to introduce the team. We start with myself. Many people know me as the entrepreneur, publisher, and event convener, noted for the creative blog caribdirect.com, also the creative Caribbean Food and Drink Conference and the Just Caribbean Festival in 2018, and also the founder of the African Caribbean Sustainability and Investment Summit, ACSIS, which is responsible for this webinar. We have Dr. Michelle S. Mosley. She's a consultant, coach, and educator, versatile financial consultant, educator, and life coach professional, expertise in advanced consultation strategies, investment advice, and retirement planning, and all aspects of life coaching. We also have with us Dr. Uche Igwe, political economy analyst, visiting fellow both at the Ferrot's Lalji Institute for Africa at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and the International Centre for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales. Our producer is Madison Tavares, dedicated to amplifying authentic Caribbean stories. Her storytelling expertise will help elevate ACSIS's global impact and foster great inclusion in its narrative. And last but not least, our very own researcher, Atinuke Akintolu, senior campaign manager with 10+ years experience delivering global brand campaigns, driving audience engagement, and leading purpose-driven marketing strategies across sectors including finance, jewelry, and regulatory communications. Today, we have our special guests. One of them is Mr. Onyekachi Wambu. Onyekachi is an associate at Afford, leading diaspora development and heritage restitution. A former BBC PBS producer, he founded African Remembrance Day and advises the United Nations and African Union. He has edited key works, including Empire Windrush and Under the Tree of Talking. And we also have another well-known person within the reparation restitution space, Miss Esther Standford Xosei. Esther is a jurist consult and decolonial reparationist of Barbadian and Guyanese heritage. Advances planet repairs, linking cognitive, environmental, and reparatory justice. As PARCO co-vice chair, she coordinates the Stop the Mangamizi campaign and co-founded INO-SAAR, championing Pan-African reparations, rematriation, and movement building globally. In terms of questions, this is a bit of housekeeping. If you are intending to ask questions, you are invited to either put them through the chat or you can raise your hand. So, with no further ado, I think we should get started. We have Onyekachi with us, and Onyekachi is the first person to lead the presentations. So Onyekachi, the floor is open to you. Can you hear us, Onyekachi? We can see him, but he's...
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely. The floor is yours, sir.
Okay, well, thank you.
Sorry, just to let you know, I've given you slide control, so you should be able to move the slides when you want to.
Excellent. And how do I do that? Just
the arrows left and right.
It's not doing it.
Did you just... Okay, that's fine. I'm happy to do it for you.
Okay, why don't you just do it?
Yeah.
So thank you, everybody, and welcome. I'm really deeply honored to be here with you today. I'm out of my usual comfort zone. I'm actually in Leicester at the moment, so I traveled up this morning. But it's a delight to be with you and to talk about this really important issue of remembrance, reparations, restitution in the 10 Rs. I think the focus of this is really to talk about where reparations currently is and also what is it that our generation should be doing. Fanon said that it's the duty of each generation to discover its mission and to either fulfill it or betray it. And I will explain why I think part of our mission of this generation is reparation. So if you could go to the next slide, thanks. So just in terms of where we are in this generation, the African Union has designated 2025. So we're halfway through this year of reparatory justice and reparations. Late last year, the Commonwealth leaders issued a historic declaration at the CHOGM conference, as the Commonwealth Heads of Government Conference, agreeing to discussions on the legacy of, and I'm using their words here, the transatlantic slave trade. I don't call it a trade. I call it kidnapping, trafficking, and then enslavement of people, and forced labor and enslavement of people. But the Commonwealth have now agreed to begin to discuss this and to put it on the agenda, despite pushback from the British government. African Caribbean members, joined by Asian members of the Commonwealth, thought that this should be now discussed. There's an all-party parliamentary group on African reparations, and we now hold an annual event. My colleague, who helps with the forward to chair that to offer secretariat services to that APPG. Esther is on and will present later on. For Ford, we focus on issues of restitution, that is, return of artifacts and human remains. And in March of this year, we produced a policy brief on ancestral remains, which is called Laying Ancestors to Rest, and we want changes in policy. I'll talk about what those changes would look like at the end. And then this year is also when the 30th year of African Remembrance Day, which is a day that I co-started 30 years ago to honor the victims and to remember them and to provide a commemorative service for them. So there's growing momentum for restitution, justice, healing. How did we get here? Why is this momentum here now and in the form that it is? Obviously, if you go to the next slide, please. In 1992, the Organization for African Unity, OAU, established a reparations committee around a group of eminent persons, and then there was the African Organization for African Unity, 1993. Basically, the eminent persons groups were reported, and there was a big push at the African Union level, led by Abiola, MKO Abiola, who was a Nigerian businessman and later became a presidential candidate in Nigeria. And he was financing this. Bernie Grant attended that meeting in Lagos when this was launched in 93, and then came back and established the African reparations movement in the UK. We started the African Remembrance Day, as I just related, in 1995. And then following that, at the World Conference Against Racism, also known as Durban 1, it was a UN conference. It recognized slavery and the again, that language, slave trade, as crimes against humanity. So you could see that momentum was building. Durban took place end of August to September the 8th. We would have been much further along than where we are had events 3 days later on September the 11th not happened. September 11th happened, and all this work that had been done in the 10 years was kind of pushed aside, and the new agenda for all these, for the Western countries, was the war against terror, invading Iraq, Afghanistan, and then Iraq. And we lost that momentum really until certainly at that very high level in the international global world, until the withdrawal finally from Afghanistan, a few years ago, and we've seen the issue come back. No, go back, sorry. The issue come back up on the agenda. The Black Lives Matter movement in 2020 helped with that. Sorry, there's a phone going off. The Black Lives Matter movement helped with that, but and meanwhile, the CARICOM countries in 2014 had come up with a 10-point plan for reparations. But it seemed to me that 1992, 93, and around 95, the movement re-kicks itself on a very high level because a number of things was happening. And my thesis is that 1994 the transition to democracy in South Africa marked the end of an age of formalized African dispossession. Please, next one. And this age had been in in place for over 500 years. So beginning in 1452, a religiously endorsed papal bull by Pope Nicholas V authorized the enslavement of non-Christians, and then another papal bull in 1455 legitimizes European conquest and enslavement. And this really unleashes hell for people of African descent. The age of discovery around this period with Columbus to the west unleashes this age of European wealth, riches, and then also this age of dispossession for Africa, as we were basically our inferiorities legally codified in these European documents for 500 years. And we begin this fight back against all of this. So please go forward. For 500 years, the fight back happens, Haiti happens, and then finally, the last place in the world where African inferiority is codified is in South Africa in 1994. And after 1994, we start looking back at the victims and the battles that we face and the history that we've been written out of. And this reparatory agenda begins to take place. And I've characterized this as the 10 hours of resistance and reckoning. So the first hour was really just to get people to recognize and understand what had happened to us. The second is to remember the victims and build monuments and to them. There's another hour around restitution of our artifacts that were looted and the humans who were taken as trophies that now still sit in many museums and academic institutions. And then there's the call for reparations in its most holistic sense, including financial, for mental hurt and everything else that happened around that. And those initial four are ones that I think we confront the people who did attacked us and enslaved us. And the other five are really for ourselves in terms of the R's. And so it's about how we reconcile the continent with the diaspora, how we return. The Rastas began that journey of return. How we reimagine our spaces and begin to construct a future together, and then how we do that in terms of the renewal and the reconstruction that is involved. And finally, for 10, I hope that we end up by 2063 for the renaissance that the AU's Agenda 2063 is calling for. So those are, for me, a way of understanding some of the issues that we're all involved in. Some of us choose to do remembrance like I did and restitution, others choose to do reparations, but it's all the same movement of looking at what happened to us in these 500 years and the reckoning that I think we're currently under. So please go to the next one. So the goals of the movement, as I said, acknowledging historical crimes, honoring memory of victims, restoring dignity and justice, compensation, and addressing structural damage. And then returning stolen cultural property and human remains, decolonizing texts and building new narratives that include African contributions, and then achieving holistic healing and societal transformation. Next one, please. So what can I do? As an individual around, 1992, 93, when that process was ending and the South African struggle was ending, I became aware not about the statistics of the the people who lie at the bottom of the Atlantic as statistics, but I began to really connect with them as the lost human beings that they were. I started this Remembrance Day to remember them because at the time there were no other events in this country that had perhaps directly led to the deaths of millions and millions of people. So we started Remembrance Day to remember the victims. And then through my work at Ford, we launched the Return of the Icons program, which is seeking to return artifacts and human remains. We're working with the Provide Secretariat for the All-Party Parliamentary Group on African Remembrance, on African reparations. And that all-party parliamentary group is doing some amazing work. There's an annual conference. But the work that we do on getting artifacts and human remains, we did a policy brief earlier this year where we've said to the UK government, we asked for three major things: stop the sale of human remains. You can't buy ivory in this country, but you can buy human remains and of so-called, sometimes so-called primitive peoples, as they characterize this. So we've asked for a ban on that. We've asked for high-ranking African officials to stop the display of human remains, including those of high-ranking African officials that are there in the British Museum in their mummy floor. But in a number of other museums, our heroes who were taken as trophies to be measured in universities and put in these museums are now sometimes on display. So we want the display of ancestral remains to be stopped. And then finally, we want all the museums and institutions who hold human remains to be regulated and to tell us what's in their collection and to begin the process of returning those remains to the peoples that they belong to. The Zimbabweans would like the skulls of three of their heroes from the first Chimurenga, the first resistance against the British in the late 1890s. And they've prepared a space in Heroes' Grounds to bury them. And at the moment, there's a great deal of resistance to return those skulls. The belief was that they were in the Natural History Museum, but the Natural History Museum is saying that they're not there. And then finally, there's another initiative that we're involved in, which is about reconnecting Africans in the diaspora with Africans on the continent to overcome the breach that happened in the African world as a result of enslavement. So those are some of the things that I've been doing. But the challenge I want to, please go to the next one. The challenge I wanted to throw out to everybody was, we know that we are at a particular historic period. The global codification of African inferiority has stopped. The moment where the Europeans run societies thought they had enough power to impose that kind of inferiority and codification of inferiority is over. It's happening, but it's all informal, it's all hidden, it's not legal any longer. So we're in a new historical phase, and where we're now trying to look at the receipts, look at what happened, demand accountability, demand justice for our ancestors who fell. So the question to you is, echoing Fanon, is, each generation can discover its mission, betray it, or fulfill it. And I think this is the age for us to fulfill that mission, which is to look at what happened to us, to understand the history of our co-creation of this African Atlantic space, as I call it. The price that we paid for the ticket in terms of the loss that we accumulated, and this needs all of us to get involved to do this work. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Onyekachi, for that very informative presentation. It's extraordinarily painful when you think about the impact of I don't know. I'm just sorry. I just feel very, very moved by the things that you've said, particularly the fact that you can't sell ivory, but you can sell human remains, and that we are regarded as primitive peoples. But nonetheless, thank you for that. That has been something that we will all think of going forward in terms of what we need to do as a people. I'm now going to introduce Esther Xosei. I just need to get over this thing. Esther, you have been in this space for quite a while, and we really appreciate that, you are focusing on reparations more than the restitution argument. So I will start with just asking you some questions about, how you're situated in that space, so we can get a sense of where you are with this argument. So you define your approach as a planet repairs framework, addressing cognitive, reparatory, and environmental justice. Can you unpack how these dimensions interconnect in the context of African liberation?
Sure. So, as somebody who's involved in reparations, social movement building, I've been at the cutting edge of not only the movement building, but producing knowledge about what movements actually want, what movements think, what movements believe. And we know that no movement is homogenous, and that equally applies to reparations movements, of which there's not one. So I start off by saying that Planet Repairs is a holistic approach to reparations that builds on the best of what our knowledge produces on reparations for African people. And by that, I mean people of African ancestry and heritage, whether we're born in the Caribbean, the Americas, Europe, or directly the continent of Africa, that we have been creating and shaping. And it's because just saying the word reparations isn't sufficient to capture, I think, the depth of the analysis and the movement building that is happening. And so oftentimes you will hear about, oh, climate impact, climate justice, and oh, there's a reparations angle. This planet repairs framing, which has come from the African reparations movement from below, that some of us, and particularly myself, who studies reparations movements, refer to as the International Social Movement for African Reparations. And we felt it was important to recognize that if we look at global African reparations movements, that is, movements led by African people wherever we're located or born, that our movements have always combined not only this notion of what people define or identify as reparations, but also it begins with the fact that there's no universal perspective or theory or approach to reparations that suits all peoples and groups. That is recognized. So, depending on who you are, what your cultural value system is, you will define reparations differently. And so, the cognitive justice is key because reparations for African people, as I said, I've already defined African quite broadly, has to encompass our own knowledge frameworks as a people, which is what we refer to as epistemology. Okay. And unfortunately, we're mainly speaking English, so we're using a particular language and narrative that is not necessarily premised on African foundations of what reparations mean. So the planet repairs framing actually is based on approaches to reparations that were popularized by people like Professor Chinwezu at the Abuja conference in 1992. That went on to form the African reparations movement that Brother Onyekachi's already mentioned. And Chinwezu defines reparations as being about holistic repairs, okay? So self-made repairs, mental repairs, psychological, organizational, cultural, institutional, social, economic, political, educational repairs, family repairs, relationship repairs, repairs in our self and group understanding, and repairs to our sense of dignity, worth, and value, and repairs to our reputation. So Planet Repairs is based on that. But even his conceptualization is based on ancient African notions of repair. And one of the most popular is a verb called saruj ta, which comes out of Kemet, ancient Egypt, which is really to restore, to repair, to renew, to transform, to rejoin, that which has been separated, i.e., us as a people who have been separated from each other. So Planet Repairs encompasses all of that. So it's really, in a nutshell, the interconnection between cognitive justice. Yeah, so whose knowledge counts, whose mind state are we thinking out of when we're talking about repair? Yeah, the reparatory justice, which is huge, and there are different views on what reparations mean and also what the goals of reparations are. There are not unified goals. And then environmental justice, because ultimately there's a recognition that what has happened to us, and the term that some of us use is maangamizi. Maangamizi. It's a Kiswahili term that has been popularized by Professor Malena Karenga, which speaks to the intentional destruction of African people. And the term that is probably most easy to grasp that notion is genocide, and also ethnocide, which was coined by Dr. Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish jurist, who was very concerned with how do you destroy groups, Obviously, as a Jewish person, he was inspired by his own people's experience, but he also studied other cases of group destruction. And ethnocide, which is becoming more used in the international social movement for African reparations, speaks to this reality that even though we exist, we're here, we've survived on the basis of being a fragment of who not only we were, but who we could have been, but for the Maangamizi. And so the Maangamizi is a term that speaks to the intentional destruction of us as a people and this continuum of harm, of which there are legion. There's so many harms that the words slavery, colonialism, neo-colonialism don't quite capture it. But it is this continuum of harm through the three main recognized phases of our experience of dispossession and group oppression, which is chattel enslavement of African people, colonization, and neo-colonialism today. Okay, so the Maangamizi. So Planet Repairs really recognizes that the Maangamizi, and that is huge. We could do a whole session just on what the Maangamizi means. Not only impacted us as people, human beings, it also impacted on our relationship with not only the rest of the human family, but also our relationship with Mother Earth, with nature, with all living beings, because we were, made into property, we were disconnected from ancestral lands and the relationship. And it's important to note that when you are connected into land, the stories of your people get passed down. Your umbilical cord is buried there. So there's a knowledge system that comes out of being on land and connected to land and being able to say, I am the son or the daughter of so-and-so, of so-and-so, of so-and-so, that kind of generational lineage, which many of us who've experienced chattel enslavement, there's been a rupture in our knowledge of who we are which ethnicities and nationalities our people came from, especially those of us that came out of the Caribbean and the wider Americas. Okay, so that's really the Planet Repairs framing. It's coming from the movement from below, and it's gained academic, recognition, which is through INASAR, the International Network of Scholars and Activists for African Reparations, that myself and my colleague Kofi Mowley-Clue of PARCO co-founded with scholars at the University of Boston and Edinburgh. And we have now, engaged in 6 years of academic research on these conceptualizations of repair that are far more holistic, that recognize the harm, the spiritual harms, the cultural harms, not just the economic harms, which would then just naturally lead us to compensatory remedies. But before we even get to compensatory remedies, we have to have a proper conceptualization of what the damage has been. What is it that was taken from us? What is it that we have been dispossessed of? And we have only just begun to scratch the surface of that.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. And I like how you've expressed the Mahangamizi thing, this intentional destruction of people. Thank you so much for that, Esther. We're gonna do a holistic wrap up at some stage, but what I want to do now is to bring in some comments from Dr. Uche and Michelle. So we start with Dr. Uche, and then after this period, then we'll go into Q&A, and then we go back to the last part of the presentation. So Dr. Uche, over to you.
Thank you very much. Can I have this slide up? Yes, just to acknowledge the erudite content in the speeches of that we've had already. And I just wanted to sort of take us through a few slides and what I call random thoughts. And we've had very detailed insight already. Next slide, please. Yes, this is just a flashback, and I don't think that we'll belabor this because the two speakers have given us all the meat that we need to chew here. And I picked this up somewhere about the transatlantic slave trade. And I just thought we should have a look at this. This is apparently a remembrance of how our people traveled by boats, on ships. Next slide. Next slide, yes. So I just wanted to say, look, this is how many years now? People are still traveling. But, the earlier slide had people forced to travel. But this one, people agree to travel, but forced by circumstances that might have been related or perpetuated by the earlier slide. Next slide, please. And this is illegal mining, and I want you to just focus on relating the pictures of the slave movement, the pictures of illegal migrants, and now the picture of illegal mining. Next slide, please. Yes, this is, again, oil theft. And remember that in the first slide, I talked about movement of people, movement of minerals, and of course, movement of arms. People out of Africa, resources out of Africa, and arms back into Africa. Next slide. And look at this, resource-driven wars and conflict still in several places in Africa. And if you look at the guns they're carrying, these guns are guns that might have been manufactured out of Africa. And they might have found their way into Africa one way or the other through these same channels that probably, and I say probably, that our people were taken away forcefully many years ago. Next slide, please. And this is transportation of illicit drugs. Some of them have their origin in Africa and Caribbean, I must say, but many of them that are unknown to us are now finding their ways again through some of these channels. Next slide, please. And I said, what has changed? I believe that as emotional disremembrance can be, as progress might have been made in terms of reparation, my argument here is that very little, if anything, has changed or have changed. What I think I see might have changed is the nomenclature. Then it was slavery. Maybe today is another thing: illegal migration, illegal cutting away of resources, and all of that. So nomenclature has changed, the tactics has changed, the sophistication has changed, and geopolitical shifts have also changed. I think that there are new actors in the new ways of carrying out the slavery. But my submission is that very little, indeed, if any, have changed. Please, next slide. Yes, there are a few pieces of bronze, and as part of, and I acknowledge the conversation the earlier speakers, touched on. Few pieces of bronze here and there returned into Africa, into Nigeria. This is Benin Kingdom, and there's a lot of public relations around it. But that's not the main thing. The main thing is that the slavery is still going on, in my view, but in another name. Next slide. So my conclusion, there's a lot of work that's been going on, but I think that the fundamental issues still remain. Illegal migrants, illegal theft of African resources, and illegal transportation of weapons of mass destruction, and illicit drugs find their way through these same channels into Africa that these our brothers and sisters were forcefully transported away. So this is my contribution. I think that this should offer us some thinking while we think about restitution, reparation. Are those perpetrators willing and able to do the right kind of restitution, or is this hypocrisy and public relations? I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Uche, for those interesting points. It's really interesting because when you think about how slavery in many parts of Africa, I think somewhere around in the 15th century, had originated, it's almost, the situation it's so similar in that back then you had traders coming with red handkerchiefs that chiefs and kings saw as being the kind of product that they wanted. And they actually used that to entice their own people to get captured. What's the difference today? There's so many things in terms of social media, so many things that are of interest to youngsters that are making them victims of modern day slavery. So we talk about this neo-colonialism and all of that. There seems to be a very strong link between these two. But we're going to get some insights from Dr. Mosley, who is a life coach by profession, and I'm quite sure she has some interesting points of view to share with us. Over to you, Dr. Mosley.
Well, you kind of spoke very highly of that. I don't have slides, nor do I have a presentation. What I was more interested in is having some questions, asking some questions, and in particular, as it relates to, and I believe it was Onyekachi that mentioned this kind of like in passing, but of course for me it's a broader issue, and that is the issue of the impact on mental health. And because in my studies, what I found is that we do have a broader I should say a lot more of our community being affected silently by mental health issues. And when I say silently, I think because in our community, we tend to frown on these mental health situation. But I suspect, and I've always maintained, that it has come down from our past, from what our ancestors went through. So I'd just like to ask, that's my kind of like my bit, I'd like to ask if someone could expand on that in terms of when we're looking at reparation and restitution, how does that factor into the conversation? I am also very curious as to the whole, Trump era, and how does that look in terms of when you're having conversations, how does that look when it comes to the reparation and restitution? I mean, as we know, there have been a lot of things that are Black initiatives, including Martin Luther King, that has been tabled, if you will, or set aside. I shouldn't say tabled, set aside. How are all of these conversations that you're having within the scope of what your constant interaction with the powers that be, how are those affected? I'm going to start with you on Onyekachi because you're smiling, and I thought, let's go with you. And I believe it was you who mentioned about the mental health part, in kind of like in passing, but I'd like to dig a bit deeper into that.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's a big subject, and thanks for the coming back and offering that feedback. It's a big subject, and you can look at all the impact. I mean, it's impacted on us in terms of our religious identity, in terms of our economics, in terms of the military, in terms of it just across the board. So the mental health aspect is really important. As part of African Remembrance Day, we've been doing, and our 30th year commemorations, we've been doing a series of talks throughout the year that tries to basically look at some of the key elements or features of what happened to us during those 500 years. So the first talk was actually just trying to enumerate and basically just work out how many people died, how many victims were there. Because again, we have, I noticed that Dr. Uche was talking about 10 to 12 million people, but that is a very low figure because it may just include the people who died while being transported across the Atlantic. We don't talk about the attrition rates, yes, on the plantations. We don't talk about the people who died on the African continent itself being captured and kidnapped, and the civil wars that were produced as a result of this. And then we don't talk about the people who went to the east. So I tend to look at this in terms of 3 locations. And the figure that we were coming up with in terms of that first talk was, Sheikh Anta Diop always talked about 60 million people, but, the figures that were being put forward were between the 20, 30 million range in different locations. So that's really important. But the other talks, as Esther and myself did another talk at Christmas, and I'm just looking at the story of remembrance and how we remember what happened. And then another talk that we did in February was just looking at the monuments that we're beginning to put up to discuss these issues. both on the West African coast with all the kind of years of return and the monuments that have, or through the doors of return and the monuments that accompany that, some other ones in the Caribbean. And then what you call it, the grounds in New York where all these bones were discovered, this burial ground, the African burial ground in Wall Street. So there's a big process of memorization going on as well. And then the last talk that we did was just looking at issues of why it was that the victims were never remembered, but loads of statues went up to people like Colston and others who were directly responsible for the death, somebody like Colston directly responsible for the death of over 20,000 people in just being transported, let alone those who died on his plantations. So we're examining that. But the final one, and I've put this now in the chat, if people want to look at, will focus precisely on the question that you've asked, Michelle, around looking at the mental health issues, structural damage that has continued into African populations, and the idea of the talk is actually to give us techniques on how we survive these legacies, these structural legacies. So it's called Surviving Slavery. It's going to be on the 12th of July at the London Museum, Docklands. And it will start at 2:00, so please join us for that. The final thing I did want to say was to go back to sorry, there's this phone that keeps going on. Oh, it's not my phone, so I can't touch it. The big point that Uche made about the labor is that we have to start really seeing these things as he did, as connected, but in a much more kind of organic way. Yeah. For 500 years, African labor has been problematic, and its insertion into the so-called global economy that the Europeans created after 1492 has been problematic. Initially, they wanted to insert that labor into their economies as forced labor, free labor, which helped them build up their economies. Now, everything else in the world in terms of this global system that they've created can move. Capital can move freely, it is been more or less deregularized. Goods and services can move, although we can see that Trump is now trying to reset tariffs and reduce its mobility. But generally, the trajectory we've been on is that everything can move, even intellectual property can move now. The one thing that can't move is labor. And we need to ask again why it is that within the system that has been constructed, labor, African labor in particular, has been so problematic. Before it was free, they came and took us, and now we're still paying traffickers $5,000 if you're coming from Africa now to try and make that crossing across the Mediterranean into Europe. So why has the world economy been set up in the way that it has? What role have Africans been playing inside that world economy for 500 years? And why is our labor been so problematic and inside of that world economy that has been created by the West? And those are some very important questions, because we can't carry on looking at these things as though this period in history is not a period in history that with a number of features, and we have to capture what those features are, the way they've impacted on us, the way that we resisted those features, and the way that we're trying to move now into a different age, whether it's going to be through the new BRICS formation of the global economy, or and the way that the South wants to try and resettle this global economy. I think all of these are linked, and we need to now if we're serious, as Fanon said, in terms of understanding the mission of our age, is first of all to understand it, and then secondly to start looking at ways that we can take action to get us where we want to get us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you also, Michelle. We've got Ibukan. Ibukan would like to ask a question. Floor is yours, Ibukan.
Thanks very much, David. Great presentations, by the way, Onyekachi, Esther, and Uche. And Michelle, thanks for your comments as well. David, just to say, this work that you're doing is excellent. It's very forward-thinking, and just want to congratulate you and Atinuke on bringing this together. I've got a couple of questions, one for Onyekachi and one for Esther, but also a comment. And just briefly before I carry on, many people may not know me on this call, but I do know Onyekachi and David fairly well. So I'm a co-founder and director of a company called Restitution Capital, which is it's a Africa-focused, impact-focused litigation fund. And what we do very simply is we help African governments to recover assets that have been stolen through effectively illicit crime, financial flows, broad corruption, usually perpetrated by large Western multinationals who come into the country, they essentially extract value and take those assets elsewhere. So we help governments through private funding to fund cases against those large multinationals and bring back money. Money has to go back, however, under a very clear classification, which is to go into social impact projects, into social housing, into sustainable finance and debt servicing. So we have a very clear mandate. And from that basis, we've managed to raise quite a bit of funding from impact investors. Just wanted to pick up on Onyekachi's point, which was, what is the role that I suppose Africa and the Caribbean have been playing in terms of this post-colonial construct. One of the toughest things that we found in our work as restitution is not actually getting the money back or locating the monies or the artifacts, whatever it is that's to come back. The hardest thing has been to convince the African governments, those leaders in the countries that we operate in, that we will not do anything that disrupts the well-defined and well-protected fiefdoms that they've created over a period of time. And I think this in itself is a bigger challenge. There is a very thin veneer of the intelligentsia in these countries who are not prepared, any way or shape or form, for that current construct to do anything other than continue to serve them. And this is a big problem and a massive issue that we must continue to look at. The second thing I wanted to say comment-wise is that this issue of illicit financial flows is a big one. If you look at Africa, last year about $100 billion was lost to illicit financial flows through the mechanisms that I just mentioned. That number is higher than overseas development assistance, FDI, foreign portfolio investment, and remittances into Africa. If we didn't have illicit financial flows, Africa would be a net exporter of capital. We would be in a very, very different position. Now, the challenge we have on the other side, mentioning the challenge we have internally as African and Caribbean people, the challenge we have on the other side is that there is continuously this link in our belief that slavery and colonialism has set the ground for the perpetuation of corruption and the perpetuity of these illicit financial flows by these large international companies who feel it's perfectly acceptable to come to our countries now and to continue to extract value. And I have 1,000 examples, and I have 3 very concrete cases that we're working on at the moment, which I'm very happy to share with the group at a later date. But essentially, we're working with the IMF right now to create a small index. What is that index? It's very simply to demonstrate something that we call the corruption premium. And the corruption premium is the minimum amount of supernormal profit that a Western company would seek to earn when doing business in an emerging economy, predominantly in Africa, and how much money they are prepared to throw at that specific corruption opportunity to earn that supernormal profit. So that corruption premium is something that we will publish at some point. And it differs for each country based on obviously things like governance, levels of transparency and other things of that nature. So I just wanted to make those comments in terms of what restitution is doing. I have one question, as I mentioned, for Onyekachi and one question for Esther. They're very straightforward ones. Onyekachi, we met quite a while back, both when I was at London Stock Exchange Group, but equally whilst I've been at Restitution. I wasn't aware of I'm amazed at your work. I think it's fabulous. I wasn't aware of the all-party parliamentary group, and I'd love to understand how we could contribute to that moving forward. As I said, everything I've been doing has been focusing on, as it were, the Africa side. But I'm sure you're aware of this Church of England Commissioners Fund, $100 million, £100 million. My question simply there was what work is being done by the All-Party Parliamentary Commission, group, in terms of unlocking those funds for work in bringing monies back. How is that fund being utilised at the moment, or is there no clear direction? And for you, Esther, I love the work you've been doing as well, but I'll be very frank, I can hear some really well classified sort of taxonomies of things that have gone wrong, how they're positioned. And from an academic point of view, they're very stimulating. But the question to you is, what are your groups doing about that? So, for example, you've mentioned Planet Repair, and I'm sure there's a lot. I'd just love to learn a little bit more about what you're doing. I was absolutely crestfallen to hear you say that in 1992, there was a conference in Abuja about an African proclamation, and we're still where we are. I'm amazed. So what is it that you're helping to do to move the needle on that? Thank you very much.
Esther, why don't you go first, since I spoke quite a bit?
Sure. I'll start with the last point in terms of what is it, the groups that I mean, I'm part of many different organizations because no one organization can kind of do it all. But for the last 25 years, I've been involved in policy advocacy and campaigning, legal campaigning. I've been involved in lawsuits, which are not about actually succeeding. Lawsuits really are about educating the public about what the issues are. So the fact that reparations is now a mainstream conversation speaks to the success of some of the work that I've been involved in from the level of social movements, where when I first started out, even people racialized as Black, that is African Caribbean, saw reparations as being an extremist cause. It wasn't something that mainstream professionals across business, whatever, academia were really taking up. And it was really due to the efforts of grassroots campaigners who just kept on raising this issue. What have we done? We lobbied Bell Ribeiro Addy MP to establish the All-Party Parliamentary Group as the Stop the Mangamizi campaign that I co-founded and coordinate. Because we wanted to take action. We wanted the All-Party Parliamentary Group for African Reparations to take action on a national demand that we have, which is for an all-party parliamentary commission of inquiry for truth and reparatory justice that mirrors HR 40 and SR 40 in the United States of America. Most reparations settlements and policy initiatives come out of three main ways: direct revolution and kicking out colonizers, which we see in the Alliance of Sahel States, legal actions, or public inquiries, commissions of inquiries. That's how the conversation in the wider society often takes place. And we've been part of campaigning for that. We've also been involved in working with scholars because scholars are important for, one, making these ideas accessible and acceptable. If there wasn't research to back up what I'm saying, nobody would be taking me seriously. And the fact that we now have so many people gaining PhDs, to my disdain, off of this movement, when I started out, it was impossible literally. But now we have all kinds of experts popping up on reparations because a space has been created where these ideas not only are tangible but have currency. I've been involved in the research linking with African reparations movements in America. North America. I'm part of INCOBA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, the most well-known reparations organization. I co-chair their International Affairs Commission, have been working with them for the past 25 years. I'm involved in movements in the Caribbean and directly in Africa, particularly in West Africa, countries such as Ghana and Benin, where we are working with a structure called Ma'atu Buntu Mitao Gafrik, which is a structure of traditional leaders, paramount chiefs, that are working with their own indigenous communities to sensitize people to their own reparations claims and causes in link with those of us in the diaspora. So they're not separate movements like reparations for Africans on the continent and then reparations for us in the diaspora, which is really following some of the initiatives that came out of the Abuja process, the conferences that happened in between 1990 and 1993. I'm going to probably end on the Church of England because I'm involved in that as well. And that's the point I want to make. As a grassroots activist, and I choose to locate myself at the grassroots because I feel it's important that the masses come along with this agenda. If I was just being careerist, I would not be doing grassroots activism. But I have been one of the people that sat on the oversight group that came up with the Healing, Justice and Repair Fund, now being championed by the Church of England. I was the person who actually provided education and training to the Church of England on reparations, because when I joined the group, they were kind of trying to stay away from that word, which was seen as, oh no, what we're doing is not about reparations. And they're correct. It's not reparations. It's a fund to tackle the legacies of African chattel enslavement. But what I explained to them is whether they liked it or not, they needed to get comfortable with that terminology, because people, the general public, would judge them as being, trying to do reparations badly, which is what the public think. The Impact Investment Fund, which is how it's formulated, just to be clear, the Church of England decided that they were going to allocate £100 million and that it would be via an impact investment fund. What they then did is recruited an independent oversight group of mainly people of African heritage from around the world to shape what the criteria of that fund should be, who it should go to, and so forth. It's not even launched yet. Why? Because the Church of England, in particular the Church Commissioners, that is the financial arm, cannot just allocate this money, which is 1% of the Queen Anne's bounty that it comes from. So it's a minuscule amount of money, but according to British charity law, they cannot just allocate it. There has to be a new legal structure that's set up. So where they are right now is trying to get approval from the Charity Commission to actually administer this fund, okay? And the fund is going to go into, some of it will be grants, some of it will be the Impact Investment Fund, and some of it will be on research. So that's where the fund is at, still not been established because of that bureaucracy. And that's something I wanted to emphasize, that even when institutions of their own volition take an initiative, and I think we can all critique the Church of England one, the legal mechanisms to even redistribute some of those resources in the way that we envision as the oversight group are very challenging. And one of the main recommendations that came out of our report, which you can find online, you just Google Healing, Justice and Repair Fund, is that fund the Impact Investment Fund should be increased to £1 billion. That has not been accepted. It's what we said as the independent oversight group, but the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was, if you like, overseeing, and I know was in support of this agenda, he had to step down on the basis of child abuse scandals. But I happen to know, and I've heard it on good authority, that it was very much connected to what was seen as the churches, which is, church and state, supporting more radical demands that the church would not normally do. So there is lots of, and it's kind of like what Ibukun was mentioned in terms of, your experience of the challenges internally in Africa in trying to get these illicit flows back, but also what we have to deal with from amongst our own people. And that's also the case with the Church of England Fund. And one of the other key recommendations that came out of the working group that I'm part of, which is the theology working group, that really sets the ethical framework of that impact investment fund. What is the ethical basis upon which this fund would develop? And one of the things that we came up with is that the Church of England, should make an apology and do research and recognize that what it did in actually developing the ideological justification for the dehumanization of African people, in denying that Africans were made in the image and likeness of God, and that there should be greater focus on what were our African people's belief systems prior to forced Christianization. And I can again tell you that the biggest negative reaction to that recommendation didn't just come from members of the church who were racialized as white, who felt it was, legitimizing ancestral worship and devil worship and fetish worship and all of these kind of negative stereotypes. It came from the Anglican Church in Africa, who felt it was an abomination that the Church of England should be attempting to apologize for the demonization of African spirituality and belief systems. So this speaks to, again, the obstacles we have to overcome when movements are being made in the global north, in the West, in Europe, North America, wherever. The opposition that we often receive from our people back home who are at a different place and who are holding on to coloniality. And that is why Professor Chinweizu, in his 1993 definition of repair, speaks about the most important part of reparations being our self-repair, decolonizing our minds and the repair that we engage in as a people, because without that, we're going nowhere.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for putting it all into perspective, Esther. It's
Thank you,
it's
Esther.
amazing where we are. The old Bob Marley would have said many years ago is that, we have to free our minds. We have to come to a place where we can free our minds. But I'm excited to say that we are running out of time. Yeah, you would not think that one would be excited by losing time, but we've had a really good session, which suggests that the next time round, because we will be doing these webinars in cycles, so every 4 weeks or so we'll come back to this topic, and hopefully by then we would have had probably new information about what's happening with the Church of England. Ibukun may come back with some updates as to how African governments are behaving in terms of them understanding the situation that they're in with these private consortium and what have you. So what I'd like to do is, for the next few minutes, is open the floor for questions from anyone else who might have some burning issue that they would need clarity on.
Can I just respond quickly to Ibukun's question, and just to follow up on Esther, who did give a very comprehensive response. But I think there were 2 other points that he made. I mean, one of those is just to give an illustration of the point that Esther made. When I started the Remembrance Day, I went round, I had been editor of The Voice, so I knew most of the Black African leadership in this country, and I went round to all of them and said, look, can we do a Remembrance Day to remember are fallen, and particularly those in the Middle Passage. No prayers have been said, and there were no memorials. And most of them were very hostile to the idea. They said to me, leave it alone, slavery is gone, let's forget it. The only person who endorsed the idea and came forward, he spoke at our first 3 events, was Bernie Grant. Later on, I did ask Bernie why the rest had been so hostile. And he said something which at the time I didn't understand. He said that they needed permission. And I didn't really understand what he meant. I only did so after he died. Well, I sort of understood, but the impact of it hadn't really hit me. But after he died, of course, we went up to the 2007 event, the glorification of Wilberforce, and again, forgetting the victims. And all those people who had told me to leave it alone were now on various committees that the government had put together, and all went to the service in Westminster Abbey with the Queen. So they couldn't, and this is really important for us, come to a moment where they recognize their own loss without somebody else telling them that it was all right to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is really, this is important for us. I mean, you know, the remembrance there and the restitution, you know, of course I want all these artifacts back, but most of this work I'm doing is really for us. Because I'm saying if we want these artifacts back, why do we want these artifacts back? For me, that's the question that I'm asking, because many of these artifacts, had they still been in Africa, would have been burned by Christians who would call it, African Christians who would call them demonic.
So we have a serious mental issue.
So the question is, why can we forgive everybody else's ancestor, but we can't, even if our ancestors have done wrong, why must we demonize our ancestors? Why must we not forgive them? These are big questions. And for me, it's very kind of emotional until we can do that kind of self-healing. I don't, you know, there's a tendency to want to project outwards all the time. And I'm saying there's so much self-healing that we need to be doing, to ask ourselves why we always refuse to validate our own things, which is at the source of so many of our problems, which is our own lack of validation of our own genius, of our own abilities, of our own creations, of everything else. And this is not to say that we're not being monstered or attacked on the other side. But it also is about our capacity to then resist that attack. Because ultimately, for me, the big question is what Mike Tyson asked or said, which is, everybody's got a plan. So we know the Europeans have a plan. But he said they all have a plan until they get punched.
Until they get hit in the face.
Yeah. So the big question is, why have we been unable to resist the plans of other people, and all we do is talk about their plans?
And if I may, I will jump in because I'd like to I think everything that you said is really, really quite along the lines of my thinking, if you will. Like I always tell people, I deal with the fluffier side of things. And I deal with that because every single one of us start with that fluffiness. We start as human beings. And you have just pinpointed exactly what I was saying with regards to that whole idea of the mental side of things. We need to deal with that. We need to get in there. We need to deal with the psyche of how people, understand and how people unpack our people unpack these harms that was done. I sent David an article the other day. These students from Harvard, they were taken to see these daguerreotypes, and they were so emotionally impacted by this stuff. When we talk of slavery, okay, and I like that you said that it's not transatlantic trade, because it's not. It was a taken situation, and I get pretty passionate about that myself. But when we talk about that, we generally talk about the physical side of things. I cringed when I read some of the history books and all of the physical ailments and attacks and punishments that was levied against the people. But there is that inheritance, if you will, of mental strain, mental incapacitation, if you will. And I think that needs to be dealt with at a very core level. I understand. I think you guys are doing a fantastic job. I understand the broader aspect, but I think if we begin to understand why it is so easy for our people to demonize things that belongs to us, let's put it that way, and readily accept someone else's, I think we need to start from there. I think we'll find a lot more traction. That's just my humble opinion, but I thought I'd say that. Thank you.
Well said. Well said, Michelle. Yeah, it's no doubt that, and part of the mission of ACSIS is really to get Africans and Caribbeans working together. But that has been historically a very difficult thing to do because of the distrust that exists within these two communities. So that basically meant that the colonizers had done a serious number on us. And it's taken over 400 years for us to deal with it. Up to today, we have people resisting some of the things that we are promoting as ACSIS because they don't trust us, they don't trust the organization, they don't trust the concept. It's very, very difficult. And we're hoping that these webinars will, in some way, help people to realize that the answer is with us, not the other side. The answers are with us in the global south, not the global north. And like it or not, Donald Trump is doing us a favor because people are now looking inwards. We're now thinking, hey, you know what? My brothers in Ghana or my brothers in Tanzania, they have skills and talent that can help us in the Caribbean and vice versa. So that is why this discussion for me is so poignant. It's so important that, the points that Esther has made about, this Mahanga, I can't get my head around it. The Mahangamazi.
The Ma'angamizi.
The Amangamizi. I can't believe that people would have actually had a structure in place to get rid of. All right, forget about genocide, but to actually get rid of the Black race. I mean, anyway, words can't describe it in the way how I feel about that. And I'm really happy that we were able to get some really meaty issues here in terms of the challenges that we have as a people, in terms of how we can get reparative justice up and running, the things that we need to do as a people to secure our assets today going forward. And Ibukun, the work that you're doing there, I can't help but say it seems extremely dangerous. Extremely dangerous. So kudos on you for taking on that responsibility to get these conglomerates to answer, So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in our community. And I'm really happy that we're in a place where we are in agreement here in this forum that we need to work with each other to make a difference.
Thanks. I have to jump off to go to another
now.
meeting, but Ibukun, there was one final thing that I wanted to say to you and to everybody else. As Esther said, the AU and CARICOM have agreed a 3-point agenda for reparations, which is for enslavement, for colonialism, and for neo-colonialism. I'm not quite sure that the AU knew what they were signing up to, because on the basis of that third one, the neo-colonialism, we'll be able to now begin to hold some of those leaders in Africa and our countries to account, who behave in that neo-colonial way, who sign those contracts that in Niger, for instance, where France can buy uranium at 10 cents in the dollar, that is worth $200 on the market for the same amount of uranium. So who signs such a deal is the person who gets 30 million pounds or francs or whatever put in his account in Paris, and then he sells his country down the river. We can begin to, on that third point, we can now begin to actually focus in on those neo-colonial people. But thank you all for a really important session.
Just a quick response. You're absolutely right, but that 30 million is insignificant to the 20 billion that's been extracted by those uranium.
Oh, absolutely. No, we know, but he looks after his family, and the rest of the country suffers. So, but we have a mechanism now which the leaders themselves signed up to, where we can start trying to pressure them on that now.
Fantastic.
Thank you, everybody.
Esther, I'm giving you 2 minutes. 2 minutes. 120 seconds.
I think going forward, it's important for us to educate ourselves about what's happening, and I think to share information, exchange information about what we're all involved in. There's a lot of different things happening, and even though there's increasing visibility of the cause of reparations, which does include restitution under international law, we're also in a time of great danger, because at the same time there's state capture, there's movement capture, and there's elite capture, where resources that are meant for ordinary people or the most oppressed within our societies, not the elites, are excluded from decision making. And an extreme example of that is in the Genocide Redress Agreement, which is a quote unquote reconciliation agreement between the government of Germany and Namibia that has excluded the Over Herero and Nama people who experienced the genocide. So this is the danger of just looking to states. So, and not only are we in the movement, state capture and elite capture phase, we're also seeing the NGOization of reparations, which means that the more kind of radical, which means going to the root causes, that's the true meaning of radical, approaches to reparations are becoming depoliticized, bureaucratized, and over-professionalized, which are about contracts for consultants and so forth. And we all know that how that's gone in international development, which is why there has been a recognition of participatory development. And similarly, from an international law perspective, we should recognize participatory reparations unless people are somehow being involved in actually decision making about what kind of changes they want to see, because it's the people themselves who have to bring about these changes. Nobody from the top can do that without the participation and the involvement of those from the ground up. And that's, I think, one of our greatest challenges that we have to ensure happens, because otherwise a few people who are well positioned will run away with resources, and by the time the people have woken up, they'll be told, sorry, we gave it all to your leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Esther. Great. Well, we've actually come to the end of our third ACSIS Exchange webinar. I'd like to thank Esther, who's done a great job, and Onyekachi, who also, contributed to a really enlightening conversation. My presenters, Dr. Uche Igwe and Dr. Michelle Mosley. And of course, our researcher, Atinuke Akintola, who's keeping it all together. And, I'm very happy that Ibukun found the time to sit with us and have a little tete-a-tete of sorts. And so now we are looking at announcements. So I'm happy to say that the next time we will be having this conversation will be on the 4th of September. So we're back to reparations on the 4th of September. But prior to that, we've got an announcement here, which is the ACSIS World Reparations Restitution Conference, which is an ACSIS initiative. This will be taking place in the Attlee Room at the UK House of Lords on the 25th of September, 2025. So we'll have a whole lot of further discussion in a room. It's not a large room, so we're not expecting to have too many people in this discussion, but we'll have a choiced group of people, and Esther and of course Onyekachi will be there. They're only now being made aware of this activity, but I'm quite sure that they'll be open to participate. The next webinar will be on July 10th, and we'll be focusing on food and food security. So thank you all for your participation, for your attention and your support of ACSIS. And we look forward to seeing you again on July 10th. Goodbye and walk safe.
Bye-bye.